to the election itself, Professor, in the final weekend, candidates have been focused on, rallying and campaigning in specific regions. We hear Lee Jae-myung rallied at the capital in Chungcheong, Gangwon, and Gyeongbuk, and also Lee Jun-seok targeting youth in urban areas too. Based on tonight's trends, which regions tonight turned out to be more decisive than expected, and what might that suggest?
Oh, you're right, okay. The candidates really tried to win everywhere this time around and across age groups as well. What stood out to me in the numbers across regions that Angie was just presenting a few minutes ago was that in the southeast region of the country this time around, it seems that the Conservative Party, again, the PPP, doesn't seem to have the kind of stronghold across that entire region that they would normally expect in an election. They won overwhelmingly, it seems, the way the VOKM is going so far in Daegu. Daegu, of course, is usually the single most reliable city that comes through for the Conservatives. That seems to be holding tonight. But very interesting that in Ulsan, a city known for its car manufacturing center, that they are the two main candidates, or at this hour anyway, still pretty much in a dead heat, still too close to call. That they're also concerned about the economy, and that the Yoon government, the PPP, and the presidency was helping that community get where it wanted to go. Now, we don't know yet to what degree the local economic anxieties played into the voters' decisions. Of course, with upcoming trade talks between Korea and the U.S., the future of Ulsan will be very much hanging in the balance, I think, as a key car manufacturing center for Korea. But there we see some hesitation about the PPP. And even in Busan, again, reliably a conservative stronghold, it does seem as if the PPP is hanging on to power there, or hanging on to the plurality of votes there, but not as strong numbers as you typically might see. But again, this is an election where the then ruling party in the presidency, the PPP, is now getting punished. And in the capital region so far, I'm guessing anyway from the numbers, the way they're turning out, that Lee Jae-myung on balance will win in both Seoul and Gyeonggi-do, and with half the country now living in the metropolitan area near the capital, that in itself is significant. So as hard as the PPP tried to win the capital, it might not come through. I can tell you anecdotally, in my subway stations in my eastern corner of metropolitan Seoul, I didn't see the DP there campaigning continuously as I did 5 years earlier. You might have 3 years earlier in 2022. That's what you might expect, is both candidates out there in full force. They weren't taking the neighborhood for granted, but I could see that the PPP was working a lot harder to win over voters across the country and across the capital city. It didn't seem to quite come through for them this time around.
Hmm. Well, it's quite interesting to see, how the shift in political maps have been happening. Well, of course, it's gonna be based on the past experiences that people have observed. Now, let's also talk about the youth and generational divides, Professor. Based on the numbers we're seeing right now, are there signs that younger voters showed up more, and did they kind of swing the race in any meaningful way?
Well, what's very interesting about younger voters is we are seeing some of the same dividing lines between men and women that we began to see in very pronounced numbers back in 2022 in the last presidential election. You'll recall, I'm sure, in that election, we saw that more than close to 60% of women voters in their 20s in 2022 voted for Lee Jae-myung. This time, it's roughly the same proportion, but among men voters, by contrast, there was a big drop in support for Lee Jae-myung. Last time, I believe there was more than, in fact, I have the numbers written down here. Last time, 36% of men in their 20s voted for Lee Jae-myung. This time, 24%, according to the exit polls. We'll again see the detailed numbers once they fully come in, which suggests that men in their 20s leaned much more conservative this time around, even with the martial law declaration. On the other hand, men in their 20s did not give their backing to the PPP, to the mainstream conservative party. 36% of men in their 20s went for Kim Moon-soo. 37% of men in their 20s went for Lee Jun-seok, the third party candidate, who otherwise So for young men, that's a significant shift compared to the rest of the population. What we're also seeing is voters in their 40s and 50s, people that are typically reliably for the Democratic Party, and were so again in 2022 when Lee Jae-myung almost won the presidency. This time even more so. 60% of voters in their 40s in the 2022 election voted for Lee Jae-myung. This time it appears to be over 70%. So a big boost in support this time. Overwhelmingly voters in their 40s sending a mandate to the DP. Same for voters in their 50s, also turning out for Lee Jae-myung in higher percentage terms than last time around. Elderly voters, people in their 60s, a little bit more in the direction of the DP. Voters in their 70s, less so, almost identical to the way that they voted in 2022. So these generational lines are always very interesting to sort through in the election. And I think what's interesting, going back to the People Power Party and what happens to them, how do they regroup? Do they continue? Do they rebrand themselves? Does Lee Jun-seok try to deliver some sort of a merger with them down the road? Lee Jun-seok performed quite badly, it seems, in the general election overall. But because he did better than average with young men and even young women in their 20s, I believe he was showing about 10% with young women in their 20s compared to 7% across all the age brackets. That suggests that Lee Jun-seok can try to make a case to the PPP that his party represents something of the future to the conservative movement. Or he can try to make a case to the country more generally. So he seems as if he's poised by staying the third party candidate to continue to try to influence how the landscape plays out and the balance of power may shift over time between the two major parties here.
Right. So his policies and his statements definitely would have resonated better to younger voters. Now, we are going to look beyond the domestic picture of this. Professor, how might the outcome of this election reshape South Korea's approach to diplomacy, especially with the U.S., North Korea, and China?
Well, Lee Jae-myung has been sounding a very pragmatic tone throughout the campaign. A lot of voters who did not go for Lee Jae-myung tonight, again, according to polling data that we've been seeing leading up to the election, even according to interview conversations that we're seeing reported, a lot of voters have been fearful of Lee Jae-myung, perceiving him as perhaps too pro-North Korea, too pro-China. Voters that prioritize South Korea's alliance with the U.S. are anxious as to how he might interact with the U.S. government. On the other hand, Lee Jae-myung has been going out of his way to sound very pragmatic and pro-U.S. in his campaign speeches, arguing that a future-oriented approach toward the U.S., but a constructive approach, an approach that works with the U.S. collaboratively on all sorts of issues, economically, and in terms of geopolitics and military alliance and so forth, that this is something that he sees as paramount. And Lee Jae-myung has also sounded, I think, much more favorable than, say, his DP predecessor, Moon Jae-in, last time around toward Japan. During the Moon Jae-in presidency, relations with Japan were still somewhat chilly. They were also chilly in the Park Geun-hye presidency. Yoon Suk-yeol changed that. He pivoted the country much more in a favorable direction toward Japan. So again, voters are wondering this time around, would Lee Jae-myung go in a different direction with Japan? Lee Jae-myung so far is also voicing a lot of support for a collaborative relationship with Japan, continued partnership in the trilateral collaboration, the three-way collaboration going on between the U.S., Japan, and Korea. On the other hand, there's China and Russia. And on that front, Lee Jae-myung, I mean, he's in a tough neighborhood of the world dealing with several different political strongmen, and you put Donald Trump in that category as well as Kim Jong-un and, of course, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. So Lee Jae-myung has got a lot to work with in foreign policy, but he is also maintaining that Korea can have a harmonious relationship with these two countries, and even, having an eye toward a constructive and, of course, with China, very highly interdependent economic trade partnership in place with China. There's a lot, of course, China is Korea's #1 trading partner, and that's not likely to change in the years to come, I think. So, he's got quite a balancing act to carry forward here that he's set out for himself, and I think that means the public is going to hold him to it. So, he's going to be very excited that he's won. Of course, he's had a meteoric rise in about a decade and a half in Korean politics, but now he's got some real weight on his shoulders, and we'll see that with foreign policy.
Right, definitely a lot on his plate. It's a very complex situation. We'll really have to see. Now, so speaking of, Lee Jae-myung himself, who's been chosen as the projected winner, let's delve deeper into his personal background, Professor. It seems as though he's now on the verge of becoming president, pending confirmation, of course. So from a factory worker to a human rights lawyer, and now a politician, president to be possibly. It's quite trajectory. How did this personal journey shape the way he has been received by voters?
I think it's a compelling journey. And of course, he was born in the early 1960s when the country was still in its early stages of economic advancement, born in Andong. So he can relate to people out in the provinces. I think it's one reason he gave so much attention to a nationwide campaign this time. I think he takes a lot of pride from coming, from Andong, in a region well outside Seoul. I think, like a lot of people from his generation, he made his way into the capital region. He's, again, as I was saying a moment ago, he's not really been a high-profile political figure for all that long. He got elected mayor of Songnam in the year 2011. Songnam, if our viewers are not familiar with it, it's what's become a large city just to the southeast of Seoul. I first heard of Lee Jae-myung in that decade, actually, occasionally visiting community events in Songnam. Some of my relatives going to soccer events and the like in Songnam, and seeing the city really going all out to welcome youth programs, and hearing that Lee Jae-myung was part of that. He really catapulted into the national limelight in the 2017 presidential election when he emerged as a kind of long shot candidate within the Democratic Party as an alternative to Moon Jae-in. Of course, Moon Jae-in handily won that election, but Moon Jae-in had been on the scene longer. Moon Jae-in had, of course, been Young's chief of staff a decade earlier. He had run for the presidency in 2012. So Lee Jae-myung didn't really stand a chance maybe against Moon Jae-in, but he made kind of a splash. In fact, he was thought of in 2017 as Korea's Trump. There were a lot of people. Eventually, Yoon Suk-yeol also took that label 5 years henceforth. But 2017, Lee Jae-myung was kind of seen as the Trump-like candidate, somebody maybe a bit of a relative newcomer to politics, someone a little bit more blunt, rough around the edges, less of an insider in the national political scene, but he didn't quite make it. And in the years that followed, Lee Jae-myung became much more of a national figure. First, as the governor of Gyeonggi-do province, not just the mayor of Songnam anymore, but the chief political officer for all the cities and towns that ring around Seoul, Songnam included. And then in 2022, he made his way to the National Assembly after losing the presidential race. Tried another time in 2022, came so close but didn't make it for reasons that we've discussed, a lot of which I think had to do with foreign policy, maybe also the economy to a degree. But I think the December martial law decree, when Lee Jae-myung really put himself out there front and center on live video, live streaming his dramatic entry into the parliament grounds at a time when Yoon had sent the military over there to try to stop the parliament from taking action. Lee Jae-myung going in, his party following him in, the leader of the People Power Party also asserting the parliament's ability to put down martial law. That was a very dramatic period. Lee Jae-myung really became world famous during that period, maybe even more so than his previous presidential bid, which wasn't successful. So from there, he had the power, I think, to set an agenda as to where the country would go and really have the upper hand. And this time around in the presidential campaign, his party was united right behind him. So the DP has become very much his party over a period of years, and especially in the past couple of years.
Mm-hmm. So he has this whole background and a lot of careers, and he stood up as the nation's presidential candidate during this martial law declaration. And he has also, I hear he also survived an assassination attempt in 2024, which was very shocking. Can you remind us of what happened?
Yes, no, that was a period of contentious politics. I believe he survived a stab attack in early 2024, which, was a traumatic moment. Korea is, of course, not a country where you typically see guns on the street for starters, but knife attacks, unfortunately, are not unheard of. And when that attack happened, it reminded me of the attack that happened about a decade ago on the U.S. ambassador here at the time, Mark Lippert, who also was attacked at a public event. I know that was a huge surprise and a shock. So sometimes political violence does happen here. To me, it also reflected the deep polarization that can exist in the society, and maybe the fact that E.J. Myung had also been seen as a kind of in-your-face and polarizing figure. And of course, the other side of E.J. Myung that we have to pay attention to is he's faced several legal problems over the years, corruption challenges. You know, his candidacy was actually even thrown into doubt for a short period of time, about a month ago, when some of those legal problems, including a past alleged election law violation, were finding its way back in the court system. Those legal problems are not yet over. And I think one concern that many voters will have about E.J. Myung winning the presidency is what happens if the legal cases, come back to haunt him and if things start to look more unfavorable for him. And presidents do have a degree of protection while they are in office, but still the court of public opinion makes a difference. Alleged improprieties can make a difference. This country's been through 2 impeachment processes, first with Park Geun-hye in 2017, now with Yoon Suk-yeol earlier this spring. And I am sure that some of the voters who either didn't go for E.J. Myung or just didn't give him their vote of confidence this time around or stayed home, that may be in the back of their minds. And I think voters are really hoping that the next president will survive, first of all, and govern with integrity.
Right. It was a very shocking incident, and many would hope it won't happen again. Let's all hope for that, but we will have to conclude our discussion right here tonight. Professor Charles, thank you so much for your insight and staying with us at this late hour with us.
Thank you for having me, Mokin.
Thank you. Now that wraps up our special election night coverage for this hour. With a projected winner has now having emerged while the vote count continues, we'll be back shortly to bring you more details and reactions as well as a victory speech. Until then, thank you for watching and good night.